thank you all for coming. We settled on this room because the seminar room in the religion department is too small, barely big enough for the people in the religion department, but it would have been much more convenient for you political scientists because you could have just walked across the footbridge. But people that come from elsewhere wouldn't have been able to find parking there any better than they can find it here. Just out of my curiosity, how many of you have been able to read the chapter that this is based on? Okay, quite a few not. Good. Okay, I'll say more about it than I would have otherwise then. This is part of a book that is about ready to go off to Ashgate Press for publication next year. It's just passed the final review, and so it's just a matter of my getting everything together and sending it off, and I'll probably do that this weekend. I don't know exactly when it'll be published. I was originally told that it would that they would have proofs anyway at the ISA meeting, but I don't know. We'll see. In any case, this is one chapter in the first part of the book, which is more broadly a comparison between the just war and jihad traditions. There is another chapter that specifically looks at the jihad of individual duty. And then in the other parts of the book, I look at just war and international law, just war and political realism, and then take up some contemporary hot issues in the debates over the idea of just war. But this is intentionally a comparison between these two major traditions that are so much in current discussion. Both of them, both the just war idea and the jihad of the sword idea, have classic, what I call classic forms. They both have developed over history and formed traditions of thought and practice, and both of them have a variety of contemporary expressions. So they're important topics. I guess you agree with that, or you probably wouldn't be here. You'd be doing something else right now. But they are both different and similar in important ways. What I propose to do, and what I do in this chapter, is to look at the three traditions in terms of the two traditions in terms of three categories that they have in common. The question of authority for the justified or the right use of armed force, the question of the justifications for it, what in the just war tradition is called the just causes, and the question of conduct in the use of such force. I begin with the classic tradition. I'll talk about that. I'll say a few words about how each of these traditions have developed historically, and then I'll end up by talking a bit about the contemporary uses of these two ideas. In terms of the category of authority for use of force, there's good reason to argue that for both of these ideas, this is the most central category, the most critical category, because in both cases, the discussion of the right use of force originates in the context of talking about the community, the political community, as it would be said in the West, the politico-religious community, as it's said in the framework of the culture of Islam. The authority in that community, in the case of the jihad of the sword notion, is the person who is understood to have inherited the political and the religious authority of the Prophet Muhammad. And admittedly, this differs from the Sunni to the Shia tradition, with the Sunni focusing on the idea of the caliph or khalifa, and the Shia tradition focusing on the idea of the imam, who is a member of the Prophet's family, the Prophet's bloodline. But substantially, except for disagreement on who can be that authority, the idea is the same in both the Sunni and the Shia varieties of the tradition on jihad of the sword. That is, it has to be authorized by someone who is the heir of the authority that the Prophet Muhammad had. In the West, there is a different conception because from the 2nd century forward, in the West, there are recognized to be two sources of authority, one for the political sphere and one for the spiritual sphere. Ironically, this originates with the Pope Gelasius in the 2nd century claiming the authority of the church as over against that of the emperor. But by the time the just war tradition comes together in the 12th and 13th centuries, the shoe is on the other foot, and the debate has shifted to justifying the right of the temporal authorities as over against the right of the Pope, who, as the vicar of Christ on earth, presumably has both temporal and religious authority over everything. But in any case, the just war tradition, as it comes together, is really about temporal authority. And the notion of authority to use armed force centers around the requirement that you have a sovereign ruler who has no temporal superiors, a ruler of a particular political community who has no temporal superiors that he could in principle appeal to for adjudication of disputes. Within that frame, within the frame of the political community, anyone else can in principle appeal a dispute to higher authority. And anyone within that community doesn't have the right to initiate resort to force to resolve the dispute. But a sovereign has that right. So when you have disputes among sovereigns or between sovereigns, or when you have cases of people that challenge the sovereign's governance, then the sovereign has the right to use armed force in reaction to this. So on both sides, there is the matter of locating the authority for the use of force in the highest leader in the community. As for justifying cause, in the case of the just war tradition, early on there was debate over the idea of defense. If one looks back at the canonist Gratian in the middle of the 12th century, who really starts pulling the rather scattered just war ideas together, there is a quotation from Isidore of Seville that lists just cause, among the just causes, defense against attack. And then there is a quotation from Augustine listing two other reasons, namely recovery of something which has been wrongly taken and punishment of evildoing. By the time the tradition comes together, though, after Gratian, the matter of defense has been essentially bracketed out or perhaps raised to a higher level, because the entire discussion of the use of armed force is placed in the context of defense of the common good of the political community and of the community of communities, that is, the relations among political communities. To put a nail in the coffin of whether defense ought to be listed as a separate just cause for a resort to force, Pope Innocent IV in the latter part of the first half of the 13th century has a discussion, a decretal on this, a commentary on this, in which he points out that defense is actually guaranteed in the natural law, that everyone has the right of self-defense against an attack that is in progress, so that you don't need to say that, in effect, within the context of justifying the sovereign's resort to force, because anybody has that right. Now, the way this works out in the case of thinking about Justum Bellum, the just war, is that if someone, let's say Manny Midlarski, is attacked by Andrew Murphy, Manny has the right to defend himself on the spot. But if Andrew gets away with it and then runs off, Manny does not have the right to chase him down and punish him for that. He has to come to me, the sovereign, and I have to decide whether to do that and what punishment is appropriate and so on. So that's the way the business sorts out. These two criteria that Augustine provides become then the basis for the notion of justifying cause within the just war tradition. And both of them frankly, look much more like the punishment of internal miscreants, that is, criminals. But they apply also in the relations between and among sovereign communities as the tradition begins to be applied. So retaking that which has been wrongly taken, if there's an incursion to seize property, let's say, or seize people, and then the punishment of evil doing. Notice the punishment of evil doing, not the punishment of evil. Evil as an abstraction is not the issue. Evil lurks in the hearts of men. But evil doing is a different matter. That challenges the good of the political community, the order, justice, and peace of the political community. And so the ruler has a responsibility to the community to punish evil doing as a way of maintaining that order, justice, and peace, and restoring it if it has been disturbed. In the case of the tradition on jihad of the sword, the justifications are of two sorts. One has to do with the way that the early jurists, the jurists of the early Abbasid period, that is the late 8th century, the early 9th century, who first defined the tradition on jihad of the sword in a concrete way, they place this within a context of a general understanding of relations among political entities within the world that they called CR, S-I-Y-A-R. And CR is the theory of the relationships between the Islamic community, the Dar al-Islam, the abode of Islam, and all the rest of the world, which is divided into many different communities. But the thing that all the rest of the world has in common is, or the things that it has in common is, A, because of this pluralism, these entities are always fighting among themselves, and B, these entities are all ruled by deficient laws, so that they do not afford the justice and peace that one finds within the Dar al-Islam. As a result of this, this chaos and this violence that is found in the other part of the world, then, the early Abbasid jurists referred to the rest of the world as the Dar al-Harb, the territory or the abode of war. So the discussion of jihad of the sword is set within the context of the understanding of the relationships between the Dar al-Islam, ruled over by the heir of the authority of the Prophet, and the rest of the world, the Dar al-Harb, which is understood as the source of all the violence, all the warfare, all the dissent that there is in the world. Because of the Dar al-Harb's nature, it threatens the Dar al-Islam. So the first justification that the jurists provide for resort to the sword in striving in the path of God, which is the fundamental meaning of jihad, is defense against this activity that comes from the Dar al-Harb. The second reason is a justification for offensive use of force against entities within the Dar al-Harb as a way of extending the order provided by Islamic law into them, and thus bringing them to a more perfect, just society, and thus a more peaceful society. The only place that you can have genuine peace is in a society where submission to the law of God is the law of the land. And so the second justification for the use of armed force in the Islamic tradition is extending this rule. It's not about extending the religion of Islam. It's rather about extending the rule of law, if you will. And so the kind of argument that you find in these juristic writers is an argument which, in many ways, sounds like the contemporary arguments that we hear about extending the rule of law into chaotic failed states, for example, or restoring a society after that's been torn by armed conflict after the end of the conflict by instituting the rule of law. That's the same kind of thinking that you find among these people. What is the end of this? What is the purpose of this? In the just war tradition, this is described as the creation of peace. But it is peace understood, borrowing a term from Augustine, as the tranquility of order, tranquilitas ordinis, the tranquility of order. That is, a peace that is based upon an order which ensures justice within the society. It is not the eschatological peace of the city of God, which exists in the next world. That is pax. But tranquilitas is what you get, what you're aiming at in the here and now. In the case of the Islamic tradition, there really is an eschatological element to it, though, because the notion is that in the long run, God is going to bring about submission to his law throughout the world. Everyone is going to be in submission to the law of God. And then genuine peace will result from that. So the Dar al-Islam, by extending the rule of law piecemeal through the use of force, is in fact cooperating in this grand historical development that is taking place also by other means. Conquest is not the only way that this is happening. It's happening by the other forms of jihad, namely the example that is set by the actions of Muslims, by the words that go out from Muslims, that is their speech, and by the right thinking that is generated by the thinking that is done in accordance with Islamic law. So these peaceful forms of the propagation of Islam are proceeding also, but the jihad of the sword as one element of the jihad of the hand, striving in the path of God by human actions, it fits within this broader scheme of things. And the aim really is an earthly society that has been brought to this ultimate form of peace. So there are differences between the two on this. Now, those are all similarities, and they're important similarities, although in some ways they are simply superficial similarities, because there are differences that are also very important. On the matter of the authority, this issue of whether the society is conceived of as in entirely temporal terms, so that the reference point is natural law and the practical interactions among nations, or whether it's conceived in religio-temporal terms, that is, as an interaction, or whether the society is conceived in religio-political terms as a society which has been given the right law by revelation and then organizes itself in conformity to that. These turn out to be significant issues where there are different religions in the Dar al-Harb. The people who are adherents to those religions may resist the supersessionism that would be involved in the imposition of Islamic law. And so from the standpoint of a society or a culture that thinks in terms of a distinction between the political and the spiritual, or the temporal and the spiritual, the practice of jihad of the sword looks like holy war. This is, however, roundly rejected within the frame of Islam, because the law of God is simply the right way to do things. It is also imprinted on existence, upon the world, upon us. And if we choose not to follow it because we don't choose to look at that in the right way, then we have to be reminded of this by the revealed law, which then serves as a kind of external reminder of what is written on us internally. So that from the standpoint of Islam, this is a warfare that is in terms of putting us in touch with the way things ought to be in the world, and that turns out to look very much like the arguments from natural law that you find in the Western tradition. A second issue arises when one thinks of justification. The emphasis in the Western tradition is clearly on defense in the overall sense of the common good and so on, but also on punishment of evildoing in the sense of violation of relationships and laws that are defined by the natural law, as well as by the law of the state. But and there's no problem so far as we're thinking of jihad of the sword in its defensive mode. But when we're thinking of jihad of the sword in its offensive mode, then this begins to look very much like an imperialism. And there are real strictures built into this within the Western tradition. It is admitted early on that a sovereign ruler has the right to use force in assisting the overthrow of tyranny, but whether the sovereign ruler has the right to initiate the use of force to overthrow the neighboring sovereign who happens to be a tyrant, that's a lot harder to find a serious justification for. And that's exactly the argument that's made within the context of the juristic writing on the jihad of the sword. Another issue that comes in here is that the jihad of the sword is defined by the early jurist writers in terms of two different kinds of obligations. There is the obligation of the community, which requires the authorization by the caliph or by the imam. But then there is the obligation of the individual. Depending on the context in which this is discussed, and depending on, to some degree on the individual writer you look at, you'll find two different versions of the jihad of individual duty being emphasized. One appears, first of all, in the Al-Shafi'i, who was one of the two major theorists at the beginning of this tradition. And for him, it's simply the definition of the rules that govern when somebody actually does have this individual duty to engage in jihad. And his argument is you don't have that duty unless you are a male of military age who is able to present himself for fighting with his provisions for the duration of the campaign, with his own mount, and with his own weapons. Well, not everybody is able to do this, obviously. And so for Shafi, the notion of individual duty is really a limiting criterion, first and foremost, although it does oblige those who fit those criteria to present themselves. Once they've presented themselves, the caliph or his military commander gets to choose, and he may send some of them home. But the requirement of presenting yourself is determined by whether you fit those criteria in Shafi'i's version of the jihad of individual duty. But even at the time that Shafi'i was writing, another notion of individual duty was developing, of the jihad of individual duty was developing on the Byzantine frontier, where there was all kinds of raiding back and forth between forces from the Byzantine side and forces from the side of the Dar al-Islam. There, the idea became associated with the responsibility that Muslims in the immediate area of an incursion have to resist the incursion until forces from the nearest fort, the nearest outpost of caliphal authority, could come in to carry on the fight and repel the invaders. And in that context, the notion of jihad of individual duty begins to be defined significantly more broadly, so that it's not simply the males of fighting age, but anybody who is able to wield a weapon. Their kids, their ancient parents, their wives, all can go out and roll boulders down on the trail, or build a barricade to stop the invaders, all this kind of thing. And secondly, since it is assumed that the invaders have no camp followers with them, after all, they're just coming in for a raid, everybody who is involved in the incursion is regarded as a combatant, and they can all be killed or captured. In normal warfare of collective duty, the assumption, and I'll say more about this in a moment, is that there are some people who may not be directly injured, and others who may be, and that so that distinction gets abrogated in the warfare on the frontier. Then the third thing is to note that in the context of this warfare, there is still the obligation of trying to get the forces of the collective, the Dar al-Islam as a whole, to come in. But until that happens, the emergency remains on those people who are right there. And the reason this is an important development is that this is actually the notion of the jihad of individual duty that contemporary radical Islamism builds on, not the notion that you find in Shafi'i. And it's really Shafi'i's notion that you find again and again and again in juristic writing later on. But it's this early experience on the Tugur, the frontier between the Byzantine and Islamic territories, that this notion develops. So that's also a difference. Now, thirdly, as to the matter of conduct, there really are more similarities here at first blush than there are differences, because both traditions have a definition of non-combatancy and an idea of non-combatant immunity. The same classes of people get singled out in the just war discussions and in the discussions of jihad of the sword. Women, minor children, the aged, the infirm, in some of the discussions, those who are mentally incompetent, in most of the discussions, people who are practicing the religious life, that is, monks or pilgrims or whatever. The difference is, though, that in the Islamic tradition, these may still be major slaves. They may still be captured and taken back as booty of war to the Dar al-Islam, where they can be distributed among the fighters or however at the decision of the caliph. They can also be set free. But in the West, the assumption is that these people have an immunity, which means that they can't even be they can't be injured in any way. So they can't be made prisoners of war and enslaved. So there turn out to be some real differences in the classic forms of these traditions, as well as some very basic similarities. Now, as these two traditions have developed over time, the trend within the just war frame is towards the increasing secularization of the ideas that are first put down in a kind of combined religio-secular form, with canon lawyers and theologians providing the initial impetus, but then other input coming in from secular lawyers, students of Roman law, other input coming in from the code of chivalry and from the general practice of warfare, and still other influences coming in from the developing interrelations of sovereigns in the context of ongoing historical life together. In the Islamic frame, though, the discussion tends to develop in the context of there being actually never any completely unified Dar al-Islam. So the notion of a unified Dar al-Islam is an ideal, but one that never actually existed in practice. Instead, there are competing caliphates. There's already one in Andalusia at the time the Jihad tradition is coming together. Shortly after that, one is formed across the Straits of Gibraltar in North Africa. Not long after that, you have one in Egypt, and so the question becomes who in fact has the authority, and the answer in historical terms is it is in practical terms whoever has the local authority, and this extends down to the level of the regional emir or commander of the faithful, who may not be in immediate contact with whoever his caliphal authority is. So that the actual practice of jihad of the sword turns out to have been modified by historical circumstances so as to interpret the juristic conception more in the sense of an ideal which every Muslim culture ought to follow than in the sense of a single reality that actually extends from Baghdad, the seat of the caliphate, out to the entire Muslim world. The big change in the frame of the just war discussion comes at the beginning of the modern period. In the writings of Grotius and in the Peace of Westphalia at the end of the 30 Years' War, where the notion of sovereignty shifts markedly. Earlier it had been focused on the person of sovereigns and on the personal responsibility that sovereigns have, but in Grotius's thinking it shifts to a conception of sovereignty as having to do with a territory with definite borders inhabited by particular people with their own rights and privileges, and a leader that is in accord with this. So that in the Peace of Westphalia and afterwards, the idea develops in Europe that sovereignty has to do with territoriality. And in connection with this, the principal reason for use of force becomes to defend your territory. If somebody else has laid wrong claims to your territory, then you have the right to use force to get it back. If somebody is invading your territory right now, then you have the right to use force to prevent that from happening. So the notion of defense rises more and more to the top, and put out of the picture are these earlier notions of defense of evildoing, which in the wars of the Reformation era had gotten associated so closely with being a member of the other religion that collectively Europeans just sort of bracketed this off to one side and said we don't use force for that anymore. The contemporary status of international law, I think, well reflects this development that began to occur back at the beginning of the modern period. But at the same time, it seems to me that the emergence of the discussion associated with the responsibility to protect has reintroduced the possibility that the use of force may be warranted to punish evildoing, namely to punish, let's say, the ruling authorities in particular societies who use their authority for their own good or use their authority to seriously limit or harm people in violation of their human rights. So those old ideas have come back in certain kinds of ways. What you find in the tradition on jihad of the sword is that the critical moment comes at the end of the caliphate, when there is no one that you can rightly point to as the authority who is the heir of the authority of the prophet. And depending on your particular perspective, this could actually be one of four different times. If you are a Twelver Shia, then that occurs not with the last Sunni caliph, but it occurs when the 12th Shia imam goes into occultation. And there is no imam on earth now to govern the society. For the people on the Sunni side, the end of the caliphate can be dated to one of three different dates. One is the Mongol takeover of the Abbasid Caliphate when the last of the Abbasids who ruled in Baghdad is driven out, and the Mongols effectively take over the rule of that area. Then the second possibility is when the last of the heir line of the Abbasids dies, and the caliphate is taken over by the Turkish sultans, who simply claim that it was willed to them, as if the last Abbasid had the right to do this. But most people would say the end of the caliphate comes in 1924, when the Turkish caliphate, the Turkish sultanate, the Ottoman Empire, ends and is replaced by a secular government in Turkey. Since one of these times, but certainly since the last time, there is no caliphal authority to appeal to. And that puts the emphasis on this idea of the jihad of individual duty. And that is precisely where the radical Islamists begin to use this language of jihad and the way that they find of justifying it. The use of jihad language by local leaders in opposition to Western power actually extends back into the late 19th century and is part of the ideology of anti-imperialism. But after 1924, this becomes part of the language of radical Islamism as a way of talking more generally about the effort to recover the lost glory and power of Islam, to recover the momentum of the growth of Islam, and to resist the both tangible and intangible pressures that are being wrongly put on Islam, which are understood as being an aggression that needs to be defended against. I'll get it right in a minute. Als bei Mitternacht Zeit vom Zug. But the question then is, in this context, is this emergency that is understood as being a long-term one and is understood sometimes in tangible forms and sometimes in intangible forms, is this really a plausible claim? And are the radicals really using the inherited tradition as they ought to be using it? The second question is whether the meaning of the jihad of individual duty really does properly get adopted by them, and whether they ought not to be looking instead to the jurist writers, beginning with Shafi, who really think of the jihad of individual duty in very different terms. And a third issue is whether the way that the jihad of individual duty is adopted isn't stretching it way, way, way too far, so that everybody in the West becomes an enemy worthy of being injured in some fashion. And that is really, I think, a question that needs to be resolved within the frame of Islamic discussion. And in fact is already underway as something that is being tackled within the frame of Islamic discussion. Well, that's kind of a quick overview of what I do in the chapter, and if you want to see it on paper, buy the book.
Can I just check it out at the library?
Well, you have to wait till it's published first.